The snowstorm on Vargan IV was not the gentle, drifting kind that Earth's winter postcards showed. It was a white wall of death, roaring like a living beast, clawing at exposed skin with ice-laced winds sharp enough to draw blood. The mining settlement of Outpost Joran 6 was little more than a cluster of steel and ceramic, bunkers buried into the slope of a mountain range, and even those trembled under the force of the blizzard. Daniel Carter had seen bad storms before. As a cargo hauler pilot, he'd landed on ice worlds where your breath froze before it left your lips, and jungle moons where rain hit hard enough to bruise. But this was something else. The power grid had failed the night before. Generators sputtered, lights dimmed. The temperature inside the station had dropped with alarming speed. The comms officer sent out a distress call to the nearest colony hub, but it could take days before help arrived. Supplies had to be rationed, and without enough thermal packs, the smaller bunk rooms risked freezing over. So when the station chief asked for a volunteer to brave the storm and retrieve more heat cells from the abandoned southern storage shed, Daniel stepped forward without hesitation. "I've walked worse," he lied, pulling on his insulated coat. "The trek should have taken 20 minutes. In the blizzard, it took nearly an hour." He moved carefully, planting each boot in the snow. With precision, the wind screamed in his ears, snatching away even the sound of his own breathing. That's when he saw the shape. At first, it was just a dark mound half buried in white. He thought it might be debris from an old mining machine until the mound moved, a weak shiver, a twitch of fingers. Daniel pushed closer, clearing away snow with gloved hands. A fur-covered face emerged, half hidden under ice crystals. Long, wolf-like ears drooped against her head. Her muzzle was dusted with frost. Gray-black fur matted with snow covered her frame, and beneath it, the ragged remains of armor peeked through. A Vargani, Daniel froze. The Vargani were a warrior race, tall, strong, quick to fight, and notoriously proud. Their history with humanity was complicated, to put it politely. Trade partners 1 decade, border skirmishes the next. Rumor said they disliked humans enough to challenge them over disrespectful stares. And here was one, lying half dead, and the snow. Logic told him to keep moving. A wounded Vargani was trouble. But she was clearly dying, and Daniel had never been the type to walk past someone in need. Species be damned. "Hang in there," he muttered, sliding his arms under her and hauling her upright. She was heavier than she looked, all muscle beneath the fur, and her body radiated barely any warmth. He threw her over his shoulder, bracing against the wind as he turned back toward the outpost. Every step felt like wading through cement, and by the time the station's steel doors loomed out of the blizzard, his legs burned and his lungs ached. Inside, the air was barely warmer, but it was shelter. Daniel carried her straight to the emergency heater unit, kneeling beside it as he pulled the last of the snow from her fur. She stirred faintly, eyelids fluttering open to reveal golden eyes sharp even in weakness. She said something in her own language, words rolling like a low growl, but Daniel didn't understand. Her gaze lingered on him for a heartbeat before slipping shut again. That night, the storm grew worse. 2 more sleeping rooms iced over, forcing people to crowd into the few remaining heated spaces. Daniel's own bunk was one of the last with a functioning thermal unit, but even then, the heat barely held against the cold seeping through the walls. The Vargani female still hadn't regained full consciousness. Medical supplies were limited, and she needed warmth more than anything else. Daniel knew the quickest way to save her from hypothermia was simple shared body heat. He sighed, pulling off his coat and climbing onto the narrow bunk beside her. He wrapped her in both blankets, then pulled her against his chest. Her fur was coarse but soft beneath the dampness, and after a while, he felt the faintest warmth returning to her. He didn't think much of it. To him, it was just survival, what any decent person would do in the cold. She was alive, breathing, and that was enough for him to sleep soundly despite the howling storm outside. He didn't know yet that this single act, this quiet night of shared warmth, was about to change his life forever. Daniel woke to the thin glow of daylight filtering through the frost-covered window. The storm's roar had faded to a muffled hum, the outpost's metal walls groaning as if exhaling after a night of punishment. For a moment, he didn't move. The bed was warmer than it had any right to be in a station whose heaters were on their last legs. Then he realized the warmth was gone. The space beside him was empty. Sitting up, he scanned the small room. The Vargani female was nowhere in sight. The blankets were crumpled where she had lain, the faint indentation of her body still visible. A part of him felt relief she was alive and apparently strong enough to move, but another part was unsettled. He'd expected at least a word of thanks. He swung his legs over the edge of the bunk, wincing as his bare feet touched the cold floor. That's when he felt it, a sting, sharp and burning on his left shoulder. Frowning, he pulled the collar of his shirt aside. His breath caught. Etched into his skin was a darkened mark, almost like a brand. It was no random burn, this was deliberate. A crescent moon crossed by 3 claw marks, the lines crisp, the shape precise. The skin around it was tender, but it didn't feel like it came from heat or metal. It was as if his body itself had been convinced to change. He was still staring at it when the door hissed open. The Vargani stepped in, no longer the half-frozen figure from the snow. She was dressed now in dark leather armor reinforced with plates of matte steel. Her fur had been brushed and braided, gold eyes bright and alert. Standing, she was nearly a head taller than Daniel, with a presence that filled the cramped room. Like a blade unsheathed, her gaze locked onto him immediately. She crossed the room in 3 strides and stopped too close, her shadow falling over him. "You are mine now," she said, her voice low and firm with an accent that curled around each word. Daniel blinked, certain he had misheard. What?" She tilted her head, one ear twitching as if annoyed. "You shared my sleeping space during vulnerability. You gave me your warmth. I have marked you. We are life mates now. By Vargani law, our bond is sealed." Daniel gave her a flat look. "Right, sure, and I'm the king of Jupiter." Her eyes narrowed. She gestured to his shoulder. "The clay mark does not lie. My scent is in your blood now, and yours in mine. You belong to me." He barked out a laugh, shaking his head. "Listen, Lady Koresh, or whatever your name is, I was just keeping you from freezing to death. That's it. I'm not doing whatever this is." Her lips curled back slightly, revealing sharp canines. The movement was predatory, but there was no malice, only certainty. "It is not your choice, human." The last word carried a weight he couldn't quite place. Daniel stood, squaring his shoulders. "Look, I'm flattered, but humans don't work like that. We don't just—" He made a vague gesture toward her mark on his shoulder. "Get married because we took a nap together." She didn't flinch. "Then humans are fools. You risked your life for me. You gave me your bodies. Heat when I was too weak to stand. In my people's eyes, you have already proven you will protect me. I will protect you in return. That is the bond." Her tone was final. Not a threat, just a statement of fact. Daniel sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. This was insane. She couldn't just declare they were whatever she thought they were. And yet, every time he looked at the mark, his stomach knotted. It wasn't just ink or a burn. It felt alive. The air between them hung heavy with unspoken questions. Finally, she stepped back, still watching him like a wolf watches prey, but also like a wolf guarding something precious. "Eat," she said simply, jerking her head toward the mess. "Hall, you will need your strength." Daniel didn't move immediately. He was still caught between disbelief and a creeping awareness that whatever had happened last night wasn't something he could just shrug off, because deep down, he could already feel it. The mark wasn't just on his skin. It was under it. In his blood, and the way her presence seemed to anchor itself inside him. And that realization scared him more than the storm ever had. She followed him everywhere. Not in the casual, friendly way that coworkers might stick together in an unfamiliar place, but like a bodyguard shadowing a target. She walked 2 steps behind him in the corridor, scanning every passing face with narrowed, calculating eyes. When they ate in the mess hall, she sat directly across from him, elbows resting on the table, her plate untouched until his was full out at first. Daniel assumed it was some leftover warrior instinct. The Vargani were a predator-descended people with a culture built on loyalty and dominance hierarchies. But it quickly became obvious that it was more than that. She wasn't just protecting him. She was claiming him. They had been stuck in Outpost Joran 6 for 3 days now. The repair crew for his shuttle was still snowed in at another station, and the main trade route was clogged with drift so deep that even crawler convoys couldn't get through. The outpost was small, barely enough rooms for 100 people, and isolation had a way of forcing strangers to learn more about each other than they planned. It started with her name. Koresh Vorn, she said one evening as they shared a table in the mess. You will call me Koresh. Not Letty, not Volf Alien, my name, he smirked. Daniel Carter, you can call me Daniel. Not human, not meatbag. Her ears flicked in what might have been amusement. Daniel, she repeated, as if testing the weight of it in her mouth. Good name. Strong sound. She spoke Terran Common fluently, though with a low growl to certain consonants. In turn, she began teaching him fragments of Vagani speech. Words for food, for weather, for danger. And inevitably, for things he hadn't asked about. Vornchak, she said one night, tapping the mark on his shoulder. Life mate. They. One who shares breath and blood. Daniel sighed. We really have to keep talking about this? Yes, she replied without hesitation. You do not understand the bond, so she explained. The claim mark wasn't just symbolic, it was biological. Vargani skin excreted a bonding enzyme during what they called the vulnerability sleep when one was on the edge of unconsciousness from exhaustion or injury. If another person stayed in close contact for long enough, the enzyme reacted with their skin and pheromones. If compatibility was high, the mark would form darkened pigment fused into the dermis, permanent and resistant even to surgical removal. For 2 Vargani, the mark came with more heightened scent recognition, instinctive, trust responses, and a subtle hormonal link that encouraged loyalty. For humans? Koresh admitted she wasn't sure what it would mean. The bond had never been tested on their species before. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. So you're saying I'm your husband now? Without even a proposal? She tilted her head, ears perked forward. Proposal? Humans make bargains for loyalty? Strange. That's not. He cut himself off. Explaining human marriage traditions to a Vargani was like explaining jazz to a brick wall. Still, the more she talked, the more he realized this wasn't something she would drop. To her people, the bond was sacred, unbreakable. Backing out wasn't an option. And while Daniel wanted to laugh it off, he couldn't shake the faint, unnerving truth that since that night, he'd felt different, more aware of her presence, more attuned to the sound of her voice in a crowded room. He kept telling himself it was just the isolation. Just the fact that she was the only one here who seemed genuinely invested in his safety. But deep down, a quiet part of him wondered if the mark was doing something to him, too. That suspicion only deepened the next morning when 2 of the station's mining crew approached him in the corridor. They had the swagger of boardmen looking For trouble. Hey, Spacer, one of them said, blocking his path. You know your shadow's been glaring at everyone who talks to you? Makes the rest of us a little uncomfortable. Before Daniel could answer, Koresh appeared at his side, silent and sudden as a blade sliding from a sheath. She didn't speak to the miners. She just stood there, eyes locked on theirs, shoulders squared. The air between them seemed to thicken, and within seconds, the two men muttered excuses and backed away. Daniel watched them go, then looked at her. Was that necessary? It started with the comms operator's voice over the station intercom, sharp, urgent. Unidentified life signs approaching. 9 of them, armed. Everyone in the mess hall froze. On Vargan 4, armed visitors rarely meant friends. Koresh's ears twitched. She rose from the table in one fluid motion, her hand resting on the hilt of the long, curved blade at her hip. Without a word to Daniel, she moved toward the airlock. He followed, because of course he did. He wasn't about to let her walk into danger alone, even if she was more than capable of handling herself. When the outer doors slid open, the cold wind rushed in, carrying the scent of fresh snow and something else, something sharp and wild. 9 figures emerged from the white haze, tall and broad-shouldered, clad in furs and armor marked with crimson paint. Their eyes gleamed gold in the dim light. Vargan, but these were not Koresh's allies. The tension in her body told Daniel. That much before anyone spoke. The leader stepped forward, his fur darker than the rest, braids decorated with bone charms. His gaze flicked from Koresh to Daniel, then lingered on the mark visible beneath the edge of Daniel's collar. So, the leader growled, his voice a deep rumble. It is true. Koresh Vorn has bonded with an outsider. Koresh bared her teeth. Mind your tongue, Varric. This is not your territory. Varric's lips curled into a smirk. Not my territory, no. But your scent was carried far, Koresh. You were meant to return for the mate trials. Instead, we find you here. Marked to a human. His tone dripped disdain. A weak-blooded prey species. Daniel felt Koresh shift subtly, placing herself between him and Varric. The bond is sealed. It is done. Not yet, Varric said, and the other Vargani chuckled darkly. Challenge me. If you win, keep your pet. If you lose, he is mine to deal with as I please. Daniel opened his mouth to protest, only for Koresh to cut him off with a sharp shake of her head. I will not fight you for my mate. He is not a prize. He is mine. Varric's smirk deepened. Then perhaps I will take him without the fight. That was the spark. In the space of a heartbeat, Koresh moved, drawing her blade in a single, fluid motion, its curved edge gleaming in the pale light. The raiders surged forward, and the outpost erupted into chaos. Daniel backed up as Koresh met the first attacker head-on, her strikes precise and devastating. She fought like a storm, every movement controlled, every blow landing with brutal efficiency. But there were too many. 2 flanked her, driving her back, while another broke off toward Daniel. The raider's weapon was a jagged knife, its edge shimmering with frost. Instinct took over before Daniel could think. He grabbed the attacker's wrist, twisted hard, and shoved. The knife clattered to the floor as Daniel drove his shoulder into the raider's chest, sending him sprawling. Pain flared in Daniel's ribs, but adrenaline drowned it out. He kicked the weapon away, grabbed a length of pipe from the wall, and swung at another raider who got too close. The clang of metal against armor rang through the narrow corridor. By the time the fight ended, 3 of the raiders were down in the snow outside, groaning or unconscious. The others retreated, dragging their wounded. Varric snarling threats as he disappeared into the blizzard. Koresh stood over the threshold, blade still in hand, chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. Her fur was matted with snow and blood not hers, Daniel realized with relief. She turned to him then, eyes bright with something more than battle heat. Pride. You fight for me, she said, her voice low and steady. Good, we will be strong. Daniel leaned against the wall, pipe still clutched in his hands, heart hammering. I didn't fight for you, he said automatically, though the words felt hollow. I fought because they were trying to kill. May. Koresh stepped closer, so close that he could see the faint frost still clinging to the tips of her fur. Yes, she said softly. That is the same thing. By the time the outpost shuttle repairs were complete, the blizzard season was finally breaking. The skies over Vargan were still pale and cold, but the endless white storms had given way to scattered sunlight and occasional blue patches. Daniel stood in the hangar, duffel bag slung over one shoulder, staring at the repaired shuttle that would take him back to human space. After a week of snow, cramped bunks, and an unshakable Wolfkin shadow, he could finally leave. He should have felt relieved. Instead, his chest felt heavier than his bag. Koresh was across the hangar, speaking with one of the outpost guards in low, rapid Vargani. She hadn't asked him if he was going. She hadn't tried to convince him to stay. She just watched. Always watched. When she finished, she walked toward him, boots clicking softly against the deck plating. She stopped just short of him, golden eyes steady. You may go, she said quietly. No one will stop you. Daniel adjusted the strap on his shoulder, forcing a grin. That almost sounds like you're giving me permission. Her ears twitched, but she didn't rise to the bait. The bond remains, she continued. Even if you are far away, you will feel it, always. That was the part he didn't want to think about, because she was right. Ever since that night in the bunk, something had been different. He could always tell when she was near, even before he saw her. In a noisy room, her voice cut through like a clear note in static. Sometimes, when she wasn't in sight, he'd find himself turning toward the door without even knowing why. He told himself it was just the strangeness of the week, the intensity of the storm, and the fact that she'd saved his life as much as he'd saved hers. Bonds forged in danger were powerful but temporary, right? Koresh stepped closer, her gaze unflinching. You think you can ignore it, she said, as if reading his thoughts. That you will return to your people and forget me. But the mark is not on your skin alone. It is in your blood now. He swallowed, glancing at the crescent and claw mark on his shoulder. It had healed completely, the darkened pattern standing out against his skin like ink, but it wasn't ink. It was him now. You're making this sound like magic, he said, trying to keep it light. It is not magic. It is truth. She tilted her head slightly. Tell me, Daniel Carter, when you faced Varek's blade, did you think of yourself? Or me? He hesitated. That's not a fair question. It is the only question, she countered. He thought back to that fight. The moment the raider lunged at him, Koresh had been busy holding off two others. If he'd fallen, she would have been next. And in that heartbeat, his body had moved not out of self-preservation, but because the thought of her being taken down made something deep in him snap. Damn it. She stepped back then, giving him space, though her eyes stayed locked on his. Go, if that is what you choose. The bond will endure, but if you stay, we will make it stronger. Daniel looked toward the shuttle again. He imagined flying back to the trade lanes, picking up his old cargo runs, telling this story in some smoky spacer bar. People would laugh. Some would call him lucky. Others cursed. Life would go on. But the thought of walking away from this strange, fierce connection with someone who had nearly died in his arms felt wrong. Like tearing a page out of a book before. The story was finished. His grip tightened on the strap of his bag. Then he let it drop, the thud echoing in the hangar. Guess I'm staying, he said. For the first time since he'd met her, Koresh smiled, not the faint, guarded twitch of lips she used with strangers, but something real. Good, she said. My mate should not wander too far from the den. Daniel rolled his eyes, but there was no bite in it. You're not going to stop calling me that, are you? Never, she replied simply. As they walked out of the hangar together, the cold wind swept in through the half-open doors. But for the first time in a week, Daniel didn't notice the chill. The mark on his shoulder was warm. And maybe, just maybe, that warmth was home.